Have you ever looked closely, and I mean really close, at the surface of your watercolor paper? If you have, you've perhaps noticed that some papers have this bumpy texture, whereas others don't. So, what is the purpose of having bumps on your paper and not having bumps on your paper? Well, what you are looking at is actually the texture of your paper, and sometimes this is referred to as the tooth of your paper. But why is it that this texture is so important? Well, what we have stumbled upon is actually the difference between two types of watercolor paper, and that is hot press as well as cold press paper. Now, there is another form of watercolor paper that does have bumps called rough paper, but for this particular video, I'm just going to be concentrating on hot versus cold press paper. So, what is the difference between hot and cold press paper? Well, hot press paper actually feels very smooth to the touch, and it's kind of similar to mixed media paper. However, as we discussed in the previous episode, there is still a very big difference between mixed media and hot press paper. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll make sure to link it here for you. That being said, I like to think of hot press paper as being hot ironed flat, thus having very minimal tooth or bumps in it. Cold press paper, on the other hand, feels very bumpy to the touch. It is sometimes referred to as knot paper, basically meaning not hot press. Okay, so we've clarified that hot press paper is a smooth paper and cold press paper has more bumps to it. But why does this texture actually matter? Well, let's first talk about the positives of hot press paper. Hot press paper, due to its smooth texture, is actually really great for detail work, especially line work and inking, watery drips, and those puddly blossom effects that you can get on this paper. And it's also known for being more evenly absorbent of your paint. Now let's talk about the negatives of hot press paper. One downside of hot press paper is that since this paper is so smooth, you can actually have a great deal of difficulty reworking or lifting paint. Another thing that I found is creating soft edges in your illustrations can sometimes be a bit tricky with this paper. And finally, another negative to this paper is that layering can be a problem because hot press paper is not as durable compared to cold press paper, and thus it can easily be overworked, which can be a problem if you're really trying to create a lot of depth or layers in your illustration. Okay, so when do we actually use hot press paper? Hot press paper is actually a widely used paper for realistic watercolorists as well as graphic design illustrators. The reason for this is because a lot of these illustrators like to photograph their work, and since the camera doesn't have to pick up the texture of the paper, it actually makes photographing and scanning your artwork a lot easier. So if you're looking to more digitize your artwork, hot press paper is actually a really good product to use. Another thing that I forgot to mention with hot press paper is, for me personally, I think hot press paper allows the paint to look more vibrant on your paper compared to cold press paper. And I really think this is just because of the texture of the paper. It just photographs better, and in my opinion, it looks better on film. Now that we've looked at the positive and negatives of hot press paper as well as when to use it, let's now talk about when do we use cold press paper and what are the advantages of it. Okay, so let's first talk about the positives of cold press paper and why that texture actually does matter. Since cold press paper has that bumpy texture, it actually acts more like a sponge, quickly absorbing the water that is placed on it. For this reason, it tends to dry a bit slower compared to hot press paper. And for this reason, it actually gives the artist more time to create smooth washes as well as effects. Another positive for cold press is its durability, as I mentioned earlier. It's actually great for layering, pouring techniques, really pushing that paper to its limit. It's also really great for lifting color, especially when you have those little oopsies happen. The downside of cold press paper is that it can be actually very difficult to do inking on, especially if you're using a pen. And it can also be difficult to do tiny, intricate line work. And this is simply due to the texture of the paper. Now, it's not impossible to do this stuff, it's just a little bit more tricky when compared to hot press paper. And as I stated earlier, I feel like cold press paper can actually appear less vibrant or a bit duller when compared to hot press paper, especially when you're scanning it or filming it or photographing it. I just feel like the camera picks up more light from hot press paper compared to cold press. Now, this doesn't mean it's impossible to scan or photograph your work when you're working with cold press. A lot of artists do this and they find ways around it. But when you are comparing the two, hot press versus cold press, I have found personally that hot press is just a lot easier to transfer into a digital realm compared to cold press. So when do we use cold press? Since cold press is considered the most versatile and forgivable paper, it is actually the most popular type of watercolor paper used by watercolor artists. And for this reason, it is also highly recommended as the best type of watercolor paper for beginners. So which paper do you prefer? I would be really kind of curious as to which illustration you liked more, the hot press or the cold press. And if you have painted on either of these, let me know in the comments down below which one you preferred more painting on and why. Now, you might be curious, which type of paper do I actually prefer to paint on? Do I prefer to paint on cold press or hot press? And my answer might be a little bit frustrating, but I actually like to work on both. It really depends on the project that I'm trying to tackle and basically what my end outcome is going to be. So if I really want to digitize my work, I tend to lean more towards the hot press. But if I'm wanting to basically create something that is just a final painting or I'm experimenting with color, I actually tend to lean more towards cold press. And that is simply because cold press, in my opinion, is a lot easier to work on compared to hot press. However, that being said, and here's a little tidbit for you, not all cold press papers are created equal. So what do I mean by this? Well, actually, some cold press papers have less tooth to them or less textures than others. And this is another reason why watercolor paper is such a personal preference. Because some artists really like having that extra tooth or that extra bumps and textures, whereas others really like to have a smoother tooth. Now, I'll be exploring this concept a little bit more later on in the series when I'm actually putting watercolor paper brands against each other in a future video, but I wanted you to also know that some cold press papers have a thicker tooth and some have less tooth. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more understanding of these two types of paper, and maybe also gives you a little bit of understanding of what type of paper you would perchance want to paint on in the future. So that is it for this particular video. If you are interested in any courses that I have, I will provide links down below. Anytime you purchase a course from me, that helps support this channel and helps support the content that I've been putting out for all of you. I really have enjoyed this series and I really hope that you have as well. And I guess that's it for this particular video. As always, y'all, it's been a pleasure and I will see you in the next one.